Right, so welcome into another episode of the CALIVEGAN podcast. Today we have a guest, Nicola. She is an expert in helping people improving their diabetes and they fighting insulin resistance through a fruit-based diet. And it's very interesting because so many people are actually scared of the amount of sugar that is in fruit. And I personally have approached a higher in fruit diet since 1 year now. But I don't really understand this topic. And I do have people um, coming to me with these fears and perhaps misconceptions about the sugar that is in fruit. And so it's going to be very interesting to hear from you. So if you want to introduce yourself and tell us like what you specialize on, what's your background.
Sure. So, hi, Stefano. It's great to be here. Yeah, I work as a blood sugar coach. So, I work mostly with people with diabetes or people trying to avoid developing diabetes, or people who have noticed symptoms of insulin resistance and high blood glucose. So, I'm a type 1 diabetic myself. I got type 1 diabetes when I was 1 years old. Sorry, no, when I was 4 years old. And so type 1 diabetes is an autoimmune genetic version of diabetes, and then type 2. And type 1 just means that your body does not create insulin anymore. All the cells that produce insulin in your pancreas are no longer working. So this just means you have to replace the insulin by injecting it, because every single human, every single animal requires the hormone insulin to absorb energy and to use that energy. If we didn't have insulin on a daily basis, we would all die. So I have to inject that and monitor my blood glucose. And it means that for me, making sure my insulin works and making sure my blood glucose is in range is even more important. But what's interesting is it means I also get to see what my blood glucose is doing on a daily basis. And it means that I've always been quite aware of what I'm eating. It's always been something I've researched extensively. And when I went vegan, I had to do a lot of research into the nutrition to check that this was going to be okay with my blood glucose. And going vegan is actually how I discovered this whole area of research that supports eating plant-based as a way of improving your blood glucose health. And what ended up not only transforming my health for my diabetes, but ended up basically shaping my entire career around helping other people either manage their type 1 diabetes in a much more healthy, much more enjoyable way, like I have, or helping people with type 2 diabetes reverse it completely, or help people who are worried about developing type 2 diabetes avoid it. A plant-based diet really is the best way to do this, and the healthiest, and in my opinion, the most enjoyable, because it means you get to eat unlimited carbohydrates.
Nice, thanks for sharing. Yeah, actually, I have a friend as well that is diabetic, and she also um, mentioned that when she did go vegan, automatically everything got better. And then I told her about my fruit based diet and the fact that perhaps you know having too much fat in in the blood would not allow the sugar to be absorbed naturally from the arteries, and therefore a higher in fruit based diet would help with keeping the fat lower. And she also found some benefits in her, whatever the blood glucose thing, in increasing her fruit intake. So something that I wanted to ask you, like, what are these blood sugar spikes? Like, is that something natural? Is that something that shouldn't happen? What's going on there?
So that's a really good question. A lot of people at the moment are really afraid of anything that elevates their blood glucose. And the term blood glucose spike is kind of everywhere these days as this thing people are afraid of. So the reality is that when we eat food, it is normal and healthy for our blood glucose to rise. No one's blood glucose is a straight line all day. That doesn't happen. It can happen maybe at night if you have very good management of your blood glucose. But at the end of the day, your blood glucose is meant to go up at a meal, come back down, up at the next meal, and come back down. That is a sign of healthy eating and your blood glucose functioning well. But when it's unhealthy is when blood glucose goes too high and if it stays high for long periods of time. That is what I would call a blood glucose spike. But blood glucose going up gently and coming back down, what I would call a blood glucose bump, is actually very healthy. So these spikes that stay high, too high and for too long are only going to happen if your insulin is not working correctly. So that is the insulin resistance that you were talking about, where too high levels of fat in the blood and in our liver, in our muscles, and basically in our insulin receptors, this is what causes insulin to not work correctly. And so glucose can't get moved out of the bloodstream and into our muscles to be used for energy. And that's where it stays stuck. It has nowhere to go. So it stays in the blood as blood glucose, as high blood glucose. But the problem is that most people, they see high blood glucose after they ate some carbohydrates and they immediately say, hey, those carbs are really bad for me because see, I eat them and then my blood glucose goes up too high. The problem was never the carbs. The problem was the fat in the blood, in the muscles, in the insulin receptors, blocking the insulin from working and from doing its job to move that glucose. So if you're healthy, you eat carbs, blood glucose goes up and it comes down very quickly because insulin is moving it out of the blood and into the muscles. And it's so you see how here it's really not the carbohydrates, the healthy carbohydrates like fruit and potatoes and whole grains. These are not what are causing the blood glucose spike. It really is a bit more complex than that. It's the high fat and excessively high protein diets that are stopping the insulin from functioning correctly.
Interesting. So I kind of had the basics then. I did
Yeah.
understand the basics. And so this is what insulin does, makes sure that the sugar is well absorbed from the arteries. Okay, interesting. And so you mentioned that, you know, whole grains are not necessarily also the enemy, right? Is there a difference between fruits and like bread and pasta when it comes to this topic?
So, good question. At the end of the day, the human body functions on glucose, and its primary source of glucose is going to be carbohydrates. It's what we're the best at using for energy. So, glucose comes from all types of carbohydrates, whether it's fruit, potatoes, or whole grains. The reason why I would prioritize things like fruit is because they have a much higher nutrient profile than whole grains. They're more hydrating, they have more fiber, they have more micronutrients like vitamins and minerals. So that's the main reason why I would opt for those as a priority above whole grains. They also digest a lot more easily, a lot quicker.
Yeah.
Fruit on average takes 30 minutes to an hour to digest. Whole grains take several hours, and it's a lot more taxing on the body. They're still very healthy, though. They're still an excellent form of carbohydrates.
Sounds good. Yes, I think it's a balance between the two is the best. And it's crazy how people actually, for the same reason, they suggest that a diet that is high in protein, because supposedly the body takes more time and burns more calories digesting the protein, but this is actually not a good thing. You do not want to give the extra job to the body of having to digest something that is difficult to digest. And it's actually much better for the body to digest something that it's easy to digest and absorb all of the different nutrients.
Absolutely. And the more that you save energy on digestion, um, first of all, the less you're going to have these energy crashes and food comas after a big meal. You're actually going to feel more energized after a meal rather than like you need a nap. Um, but it also means that your body is able to use that energy for other things. If your body is having to use so much energy to digest food, it's going to put less energy into your hormone health, into growing thick, nice hair, into keeping your skin lovely. You know, all the decoration stuff that is not immediately necessary for survival. Um, these are the things that you want extra energy for. And if you're wasting it on digesting difficult foods unnecessarily, you're really taking away a lot of potential to those areas of your health.
Makes sense. And this is the concept that all the healing processes and detox are based upon, right? It kind of goes,
Mhm.
the extreme would be fasting. That's why fasting is also
Yeah.
so good for allowing your body to heal, because you're not digesting and there's no energy spent into that process, and so your body can focus on healing. And do you have a balance between like more between grains and fruits and vegetables? Like how would
So
you split it throughout the day?
basically, the main thing is to eat foods throughout the day in the order that they are most easy to digest. So you want to start the day with foods that are the easiest to digest and continue throughout the day with foods that are progressively harder to digest. So the idea is if you eat a big meal, you've got lots of grains, you've got some legumes, maybe some cooked vegetables. All of these things are going to take a while to digest. If you eat fruit after that, that fruit is going to stay at the top of your digestive system fermenting.
Mm.
It's going to lose in nutrients, um, and it's going to create combinations of gases that are not going to be comfortable for your digestion. Um, and this is really not an optimal way to be eating. Whereas, this is why I always recommend don't eat fruit as dessert, eat it as a starter, eat it before the meal or on its own. Um, but if you start the day with fruit, you're giving your body the most high nutrient foods first and the easiest to digest, which means your body is going to be able to access that energy much more easily. And you're going to be able to use that energy throughout the day much more accessibly. So that's why I tend to eat an all fruit breakfast, something easy to digest and hydrating. I often do a smoothie. This is even easier to digest because the digestion is already in part done by the blender. Then at lunch, I might do a mix of fruits and vegetables, things that are maybe a little heavier to digest, starchier things like bananas as well. And adding vegetables also for the extra fiber and for balancing blood glucose. And then progressively throughout the day, in the later part of the day, after lunch, I will start to incorporate some more cooked foods. The second you cook foods, they're going to be more difficult to digest. And part of the reason is because the water content has been reduced. So foods that are lower in water are going to be a lot harder to digest as
Mhm.
well. Um, so in the evening, you can take your time to digest those things. And this means that you don't feel sleepy throughout the day because you're having to waste energy on digestion. So that's why I would focus on lots of fruit and some vegetables raw early on in the day and save the cooked foods for the evening. So in the evening, I typically eat meals that are based around potatoes or whole grains or legumes like lentils and beans with some vegetables, and I make sure that I don't eat fruit after that.
Nice. Yeah, I used to do a big smoothie for lunch with like 8 bananas and leches, but I recently found more enjoyment in actually eating the bananas. So
Hmm.
I stopped doing that. But I will have to change my breakfast then, because right now I do a porridge, and it makes sense what you said, that obviously if it's more difficult to grains are more difficult to digest, then the fruit stays on top of it and cannot actually be digested with the ease that it would. Um, so why do you think people fear fruit then? Some people, okay. Or people with diabetes, or yeah.
It's a good question. I think, first of all, there is this big misconception that carbohydrates make you fat,
Mm.
or that carbohydrates are the same as refined sugar, that the sugars we get in fruit are the same as, table sugar that is highly refined or artificial, which is not the case at all. Um, and so, first of all, I think something that most people are not taught is that fat storage cycles are different for the different macronutrients. Because carbohydrates are our primary source of energy, the human body can store energy from carbohydrates. We can store it as energy to be used later by our brain, by our muscles. We store that in the liver in the form of glycogen. And our brain and our muscles use this store of glycogen continuously throughout the day. It's very important to keep those energy stores very high. Which means that you would have to eat an insane amount of carbohydrates before you actually start to store them as fat. You'd be needing to eat several thousand calories above your threshold every day consistently for a long time before you eventually start storing it as fat. We are very inefficient at turning carbohydrates into body fat. But because fat and protein are not our source of energy, we really use them for other things. But they are not the things that are going to be fueling our brain and our muscles with glucose. Because we can't use, because our body doesn't like to use fat and protein as our source of energy, we do store these macronutrients much more easily as body fat.
Mhm.
So any excess calories from fat or protein will immediately turn to body fat because we can't store them as energy.
So yeah, so it's exactly the opposite, right? Like there is one of my reels that went viral in which I'm eating
Mhm.
my 8 bananas for lunch, and so
Nice.
many people like are commenting like, "Oh, you will get fatty liver," which is actually the opposite, right? So, so yeah, I would really like people to understand that it's actually a healing journey to increase the fruit intake, and
Yeah.
that building up fat in the body is not related from eating the sugar, but it's related to excess calories over a long period of time. And what you said is actually something new that I didn't know. I didn't know that it's actually protein and fat that are easier to be stored as fat in the body. Do you know if there is any difference between visceral fat and fat in adipose fat and visceral fat? Like in
So this is an area I'm less aware of
Mm.
from like a sport perspective. Um, but essentially what happens when you eat excess fat is that this fat is going to start collecting in our muscle tissue. And this is the definition of insulin resistance, is when you start storing fat in tissues that are not designed to store fat, aka your muscles. And this, when repeated, this is what happens when you eat fat, too much fat every day over a long period of time. That creates long-term insulin resistance, which is what is going to lead to weight gain and increased risks of obesity, diabetes complications, and other chronic illnesses.
Okay. So again, insulin's resistance is the inability of your body to use insulin to guide the sugar around, correct?
Exactly. And the reason this happens is because of this accumulation of fat. Um, in our muscles, in our insulin receptors, making them not respond when glucose is trying to get in. And another really interesting point here is that if you have insulin resistance, your muscles are going to struggle to uptake glucose. They're going to be inefficient at uptaking glucose for energy, which means you're not going to perform as well in your workouts. It means you're not going to build muscle as easily because the fat is blocking the glucose from coming in. At the end of the day, our muscles during a workout, as you know, they don't use protein or fat as a source of energy. They use glucose and they use oxygen. If you have insulin resistance, the glucose can't get in. You're going to have to work a lot harder for your muscles to open up to let in the glucose. And it's also going to limit your circulation, which means that you're not going to get as much oxygen into your muscles as well.
All right, all right. Thank you for explaining all this. Is there any risks from increasing the fruit intake for someone that is coming to you with problems with diabetes or insulin resistance?
Generally, no, because several studies have confirmed that there is no upper limit to how much fruit we can and should healthily eat. Fruit is really one of these things where the more you eat, the better.
Yeah.
The only thing that might happen if someone is coming from a background where they're not used to eating much fruit at all, if they suddenly start eating a lot more fiber than they're used to, they might temporarily have some struggle with digestion, but this is usually very temporary because their body simply has to get used to that increased fiber intake. But this is less common with fruit. It's much more common with things like beans and lentils because they require additional enzymes to be broken down. We can't break them down very easily. So it's actually the fermentation of beans and lentils in our gut that enables them to be digested. And you need specific enzymes for the specific type of lentil or bean. If you are not used to eating lentils and beans on a regular basis, you will have digestive issues at the beginning while you're still building up those enzymes. But we don't have so much of that problem with fruit. So here, fruit is really a very easy option that has minimal risks in terms of digestion and in terms of the rest of your health. However, from a blood glucose perspective, the only risk with increasing your fruit intake very suddenly is that if you already have a lot of insulin resistance, you are going to struggle to move all that healthy glucose out of your bloodstream and into your muscles. So this is likely to end up in higher blood glucose temporarily until you have cleared that fatty acid from your insulin receptors and from your muscles. So this is also why when I work with people, I don't recommend changing everything from one day to the next. I recommend slowly reducing their fat intake to make them more and more insulin sensitive, give that insulin resistance time to reduce and time for that insulin to work better, and slowly increase the carbohydrates and the fruit so that they don't have blood glucose going all over the place.
Okay. Yeah, so many things. So yeah, the first thing is that it's crazy that people are worried about fruit because, as you said, like science is pretty
Yeah.
clear. Like if you do a small research on PubMed, it shows how increasing your fruit intake decreases all risk of mortality. So it's actually beneficial for probably all diseases to increase your fruit intake. People don't like normal people, especially like non-vegans that perhaps have an unhealthy even lifestyle, they probably don't even eat fruit, So it would be very healthy for everyone to just eat a couple or more pieces of fruit per day. And
Absolutely.
I went through the fiber problem when I went
Mm-hmm.
plant-based six
Yeah.
years ago because I massively increased my beans intake, lentils. I was eating a lot of lentils. Then I was eating potatoes, but with the skin, so even extra
Mhm.
extra fiber. And yeah, Okay, let's just say that I was scared to be too far from a bathroom for a period.
Yeah,
Yeah, that actually happened.
that can
But
happen.
on the other side, well, of course, I was already used to more fibers. But when I did a 2 weeks period of only fruit, my digestion was the best ever. Literally, didn't feel
Wow.
bloated. Was going to the bathroom in the morning or regular, and yeah, digestion felt very good. Instead, right now, now that I'm mixing, um, is not as smooth. Sometimes I have a little bit more gases. It's still good, but only fruit was the best on 100%.
Yeah, it's not surprising because fruit really is the easiest and quickest to digest.
Yeah, and around these concern of wanting to increase the fruit intake gradually, eventually, mm, to manage better the blood glucose level. How does that relate with energy levels? Like, is it true that you can crash from experiencing high blood glucose level spikes, or maybe they if they stay high for too long period of time and then they go back down, you feel tired? Like, do you know how that works?
So basically, if your blood glucose is going high because of insulin resistance and your blood glucose is staying high for a long period of time, that's very difficult for the body. Number one, because your energy, your muscles and your brain are not receiving the energy that they want. You just ate all this energy, but your brain and your muscles are not able to absorb them.
Mhm.
The second thing is that having high blood glucose for long periods of time is very dehydrating for the body. The body will try to get rid of water as a way of flushing out all the excess glucose in the blood. And the third thing is that this high blood glucose is going to compromise circulation. So your whole body is going to struggle to get oxygen as well as usual. So everything just feels very slowed down as your body is struggling to get all that glucose into the place where it wants to be, which is your cells in your brain and in your muscles. Um, so this is often what people experience when they say, "Oh, but anytime I eat carbs, I have a big energy crash, or I have a food coma, or I feel really lethargic." It's not because of the carbohydrates themselves. It's because the insulin resistance from the high fat foods eaten previously are stopping your body from accessing all that energy.
Very interesting. Okay, I think if we close this section, I think about diabetes and kind of blood glucose, what would you like to add?
So, I would say the main takeaways on this subject is start slowly reducing the fat in your diet, start increasing fruit and easy to digest carbohydrates like potatoes and pumpkins, squash. Um, you're basically doing this with the fat and this with the carbs slowly. Um, and then when it comes to lentils and beans, increasing them in small doses regularly and very slowly is the best thing for your blood glucose and your digestion. Um, but moving on from diabetes, what were the other topics that you wanted to cover?
Well, the protein parts, right? Because obviously, when you do focus on fruits, you naturally start eating less protein, and we definitely live in a society that is over obsessed about protein, which is very interesting. You know how focusing on protein actually creates the opposite effect on health. So you actually move away from the healthiest food choices, and you train, right? Your feet got their bicep there. Show us a little flex. Did you start? When did you start training? Did you do it when you were already on a high fruit diet? And Did you find it difficult to build muscle and strength? What has been your experience with a high in fruit diet and strength training?
So, it's an interesting question because I've always been interested in sport. I probably started training more in the last 5 years. Um, but I really train in a very mixed way. I don't have a specific routine. I do yoga most days, low impact, 30 minutes. Um, I do a little bit of gymnastics and body weight exercises. I work on handstands a lot, just because I find them fun. Um, and I occasionally go for a run, but I go through periods where I don't exercise at all. For example, on my period, I don't exercise because it's much better for female hormones to not stress out the body with additional adrenaline and cortisol during that time. Um, but what I've noticed is that it doesn't matter how much protein you're eating, actually. At the end of the day, building muscle is going to come from the style of training that you're doing.
Yep.
And so long as you're eating enough food, you're going to build muscle. And there are going to be healthier or less healthy ways of doing that for sure. But at the end of the day, I've never really cared about how much protein I eat. And actually, I eat very little protein compared to most people. And this is actually the best thing for your health because your body wants carbohydrates. The more you're eating protein, the more you're losing out on the opportunity to eat more carbohydrates that will fuel your muscle during a workout. And these high carb foods are the highest in nutrients. Fruit is the highest nutrient food group on the planet. If I waste my calories and my food away on protein and high protein foods, I'm missing out on all the health benefits and other high carbohydrate foods.
Sounds good. Glad to hear. Thank you for giving another example of someone that is doing good, like fitness wise, eating a low protein diet. And I have a question from my flatmate, and she's asking if there is a relationship between eating a fruit based diet and the hormonal cycles of a woman. Is there going to be some benefits, or is there something to be worried about?
Absolutely. That's a really good question. And the answer is there is absolutely a link between these two things. As a quick example, when I went vegan and started prioritizing fiber and carbohydrates and eating much less fat and protein, um, my cycles became more regular. I don't get painful periods anymore. They used to be terrible. And your hormones feel a lot more balanced. But something that is crucial for this is also managing your stress levels. You have to do these two things at the same time. But at the end of the day, making sure that you reverse insulin resistance by eating low fat and eating lots of healthy carbohydrates means that your body is going to process hormones in a much healthier way. There's actually a certain amount of carbohydrates that women need to eat every month in order to get their period. And we are seeing at the moment a huge amount of people developing hormonal issues like PCOS, endometriosis. And so much of it is due to diet and due to insulin resistance. It's again that idea of, first of all, insulin resistance and high blood glucose is going to mess around with your hormones. You're not going to be able to produce enough of the right hormones, and you're going to spike things like cortisol and testosterone, which for the female cycle is very damaging. But also, if you're not getting enough glucose, your body physically can't do the job of prioritizing its hormonal health and, having a well-functioning reproductive system.
Okay, so all good. It's actually better to
Absolutely.
eat more fruit. Sounds good. And I noticed that you said that in the evening you eat cooked food, right? And this is something that most people that approach a fruitarian diet end up falling into. So why do you eat the cooked food and you don't have a fully fruit-based or raw diet? Is there a reason?
So the main reason is just because I like cooked food. And it also allows me to socialize more with people in my life and cook together in the evenings. But there are days where I eat fully raw. At the end of the day, I do believe that the ideal human diet is based on fruit and vegetables. And I mean, look in the wild, no other animal cooks their food. And we know that cooking food tends to dehydrate it, make it harder to digest. It's not at all necessary, but it's a cultural thing and it's a taste thing. Um, but yeah, when I'm eating on my own, I will very frequently have fully raw days where I just eat raw fruits and vegetables. Um, I do this a lot more in the summer as well, when there's even more fruit than typical and it's a lot more ripe and sweet, so it's more satisfying. And you also feel lighter in the summer. You know, you don't want to be weighed down by heavy, hot food sometimes. Um, but yes, even though I would promote that the healthiest, most ideal diet for humans is one that is primarily based on fruit and vegetables, I do still include cooked food, simply because I like potatoes and
Yeah.
cooked vegetables. I like cooking with people. But I think that if you make up 50 to 75% of your diet as coming from raw foods, vegetables, fruits that are not processed, you're doing so much good to your body that the occasional cooked foods, especially if they're still plant-based and whole foods, don't contain oils and additives, that's not going to do so much damage.
Oh yeah. Yeah, it makes sense. For me, it's also maybe a matter of um sustainability. I found it that you need to have a lot of fruit at home all the time. If I would make my diet based
Mm.
on fruits completely. And what I wanted to say, oh yeah. And so what are your five most common fruits that you eat?
Oh, I mean, beyond making sure that I'm getting enough carbohydrates, I just focus on the fruits that I happen to like the most. Some of my favorites are mangoes, kaki fruit, raspberries, um, grapes, and bananas. Bananas are just so good because
Okay.
they are so accessible. They're so sweet. Um, they're cheap and easy to find everywhere in the world all year round. I just think you can't go wrong with them, and they're so easy to put into smoothies and add other flavors too. But at the end of the day, I would not recommend one specific fruit and not another, because fruit that you're going to eat is the best type of fruit. So whichever fruit you enjoy the most is going to be the best. But one thing that I would recommend is making sure that you have a good idea of which fruits are high in carbohydrates and which fruits are low in carbohydrates. Because otherwise, you could be eating a huge amount of things like berries, thinking, I'm eating so much fruit, but actually, berries have very few carbohydrates. It would be very difficult to make a whole meal out of them. But bananas and grapes, mangoes, kaki fruit, dates, these are all very easy to get enough carbohydrates from and to make a whole meal out of. So I would be aware of high energy fruits and low energy fruits. That's how I talk about them with my clients. So just being aware that things like berries, kiwis, smaller stone fruits are not going to have as many carbohydrates. So you're going to have to eat a lot of them
Yeah.
to get enough calories and enough carbohydrates. But ideally, the easiest way is just make sure that if you're basing a meal around fruit, that you pick a main fruit that's going to be high in carbohydrates. Again, Bananas, grapes, dates, mangoes, papaya. These are going to be great options.
Sounds great. And yeah, I don't want to take more of your time. I just wanted to make sure that we send also this message, and I think you fully agree based on all we said that one of the things that also people should do is eliminating oils, added oils from their diet, right?
Absolutely. Oils are not a health food. At the end of the day, oils are pure fat. They are basically 100% fat. They contain no fiber, no carbs, no protein, no water, and they're very nutrient poor compared to the amount of calories you're eating. They're actually the highest calorie food on the planet. Um, they really don't do much for your health. And something that I recommend to people is to eat below 30 grams of fat per day. This ensures the best amount of insulin sensitivity and avoiding creating more insulin resistance. And if you think about it, 30 grams of fat is the equivalent of 2 tablespoons of
Yeah.
oil, which is crazy.
Yeah.
It's so easy to accumulate too much fat in your diet by adding oils. So, one of the easiest things you can do for your blood glucose health and your health in general is to just cook without oil.
Absolutely. I love that. Thanks for sending this last message. And I guess staying at 30 grams is like very important for people that are actually fighting with diabetes and insulin resistance. Usually with my clients, I suggest they at least try to stay below 20% and try to get
Yeah,
under 15% fat. It's crazy that most governments suggest to stay around 30% or below, which is way too high. It's way too high already.
absolutely.
Yeah. So, Nicola, thanks a lot for sharing all of this valuable information with us. Um, Glad you came.
Well, thanks for having me, Stefano. Yeah, it's been a great conversation. Thank you.
And thanks, everyone. If you've been watching this, you can follow Nicola, the fruitful coach, and you can leave a comment and like. I'll see you in the next one. Ciao.
Bye.